We cannot retreat. The ridge must be secured by morning, despite the snow.
It's useless, Capitano. We are broken.
The air isn't air anymore. It is a thick, choking fog of pulverized concrete, cordite, and the metallic tang of blood. For 16 days, the sky has been screaming. Since the first light of the invasion, the Italian artillery has rained down 100,000 shells on this single, jagged ridge. 100,000 explosions designed to erase every living thing from the map. According to the blueprints of modern warfare, the 800 men trapped inside this bunker should have been vaporized in the first hour. Their lungs should have collapsed from the pressure. Their eardrums should have shattered. Their spirits should have withered into the dust. But as the smoke momentarily clears, a terrifying silence settles over the valley. The Italian officers peer through their binoculars, waiting to see white flags of surrender rising from the ruins. Instead, they see something that defies all military logic. From the blackened craters and the twisted rebar, the survivors are crawling back to their posts. They are deaf, starving, and buried in their own graves, but they are still breathing. This is the true story of a siege that broke an empire's pride. This is the last man standing. The limits of human endurance are tested in the most brutal sieges in history. If you want more gripping, high-stakes military stories told from the front lines, you must subscribe right now. Turn on your notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the psychological terror of survival. Hit that like button and let us know which historical siege is the most legendary. The morning began with a deceptive, terrifying calm over the jagged peaks of the Greco-Italian border. For the 800 men stationed inside the reinforced concrete bunkers, the silence was more unsettling than any noise they had ever heard. They were the thin line standing between a massive invading empire and the heart of their nation. High Command had told them to hold the ridge at all costs, but no one had truly prepared them for the sheer weight of the steel about to fall from the sky. Without warning, the horizon erupted in a blinding flash of orange and yellow fire. 1,300 Italian artillery pieces opened up simultaneously, turning the tranquil mountain landscape into a literal furnace. The first hour was a frantic, desperate scramble for cover. Inside the bunkers, the noise was not just sound. It was a physical force that slammed into their chests and shook their organs. Every heavy shell that landed on the concrete roof sent a shower of fine, white dust and jagged splinters raining down on the soldiers. The vibration was so intense that men were thrown from their feet, unable to stand, as the earth itself seemed to be liquefying around them. They could feel the mountain groan under the pressure of 100,000 shells. Oxygen was replaced by the acrid, choking fumes of high explosives. Communication lines were severed instantly, leaving each small squad isolated in their own private pocket of hell. They sat in the flickering, dim light of lanterns, clutching their rifles with bleeding knuckles, their ears ringing with a high-pitched, permanent whine. They weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting the very laws of physics. The Italians assumed that after 60 minutes of this relentless pounding, the fort would be nothing but a graveyard. They were wrong. The fight for survival had only just begun. By the second day, the mountain had become unrecognizable. The lush green slopes were replaced by a jagged lunar landscape of gray craters and splintered wood. Inside the bunkers, time had completely lost its meaning. There was no day or night, only the rhythmic, bone-shaking thump of the heavy batteries and the brief, terrifying silences between volleys. The 800 defenders were no longer the fresh, eager soldiers who had marched to the border weeks before. They were covered in a thick layer of white concrete dust, their faces gaunt, their eyes bloodshot and wide with the 1,000-yard stare. Their lungs burned with every breath, filled with the fine particles of pulverized stone and the bitter, metallic tang of spent shells. Supply lines had been obliterated in the first 12 hours. Water was now the most precious commodity on the ridge, more valuable than ammunition. The men were forced to lick the cold, salty condensation off the sweating bunker walls just to moisten their cracked lips. Food was a luxury they had stopped thinking about. The hunger was a dull, constant ache, but it was nothing compared to the crushing, psychological weight of the isolation. They were 800 men against an entire empire, cut off from their families, their commanders, and the world. They had become a forgotten island of resistance in a sea of steel. Outside, the Italian officers were growing increasingly frustrated. They had fired more shells at this single ridge than they had used in entire previous campaigns. According to every military manual ever written, the defenders should have surrendered or died days ago. Confident that the resistance was finally broken, the Italian infantry began their slow, methodical advance up the shattered slopes. They moved with a sense of grim certainty.
This is unacceptable. They should have broken weeks ago.
The terrain favors them, General. Our supply lines are stretched thin.
We are losing face.
Their bayonets glinting in the harsh sunlight. They expected to find only corpses and ruins. But as the first wave of Italian troops reached the perimeter wire, the ruins suddenly came to life. From the blackened rubble and the supposedly destroyed machine gun nests, a withered, defiant fire erupted. The survivors, half blind and nearly deaf from the bombardment, had crawled out of their deep tunnels to man their posts once again. It was a terrifying, ghostly sight. The Italians weren't fighting a standard army. They were fighting men who had already accepted their own deaths and refused to leave their posts. Every yard of the mountain had to be bought with blood. The siege was no longer a tactical operation. It had become a visceral, primitive struggle of wills. The defenders were trapped, starving, and buried alive, yet they held their ground with a savage, quiet desperation that began to haunt the nightmares of the men attacking them. By the 10th day of the unrelenting siege, the interior of the bunker had transformed into a collective sarcophagus. The air was a stagnant, oxygen-starved haze, smelling of unwashed bodies, gangrene, and the cold, wet stone of the mountainside. Sleep was no longer a biological necessity, but a brief, terrifying hallucination between the rhythmic concussions of the Italian heavy guns. The 800 defenders were living in a state of sensory exhaustion so profound that the constant roar of explosions had become a haunting, distorted heartbeat. Every man in that dark, damp tunnel felt like the last human being on Earth. They were physically buried alive, separated from the living world by several meters of cracked concrete and a relentless curtain of steel. The psychological toll was becoming visible in the flickering light of the kerosene lamps. Men stared blankly at the sweating walls, their minds fractured by the constant vibration. Some whispered prayers to saints who seemed to have abandoned the ridge. Others sat in a catatonic silence, their fingers raw from gripping the cold steel of their rifles. They were no longer fighting for a strategic map or a political ideology. They were fighting for the man sitting next to them in the dark, for the simple, stubborn right to take one more shallow breath. Outside, the Italian infantry were suffering from a different kind of terror. They had been told this would be a quick, glorious victory, yet they were being ground down by a ghost army that refused to stay dead. Every time the artillery stopped, they expected silence. Instead, they were met with the sharp, precise crack of Greek rifles. Rumors began to spread among the Italian ranks that the ridge was haunted, that the men they were fighting weren't soldiers at all, but vengeful spirits of the mountain itself. The frustration of high command turned into a frantic, desperate rage. They doubled the bombardment, pouring another 20,000 shells into the ruins, determined to finally break the spirit of the last men standing. On the 16th day, the screaming of the shells finally stopped, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a predator holding its breath. Inside the jagged ruins of the bunker, the remaining defenders moved like ghosts through a thick, white shroud of concrete dust. They were down to their last crates of ammunition and their final, lukewarm drops of water. Their hands shook, not from fear, but from the raw, physical exhaustion of surviving 16 days in a literal furnace. They looked at each other with hollow eyes, no longer needing words to communicate the grim reality of their situation. They were the last 800 men on a mountain that had been hit by 100,000 shells. Outside, the Italian High Command had reached a breaking point. The massive artillery barrages had failed to erase the ridge, and now they were committing everything to one final, overwhelming ground assault. Thousands of infantrymen began to swarm up the cratered slopes, their boots slipping on the loose, pulverized rock. They moved with a desperate, frantic energy, determined to finally silence the ghosts in the concrete. Inside the bunkers, the Greek soldiers didn't panic. There was no more adrenaline left to burn. Instead, a strange, cold clarity settled over them. They calmly checked their sights, wiped the grit from their eyes, and waited for the enemy to reach the perimeter wire. They were no longer fighting to win a war or hold a border. They were fighting to honor the brothers who had already fallen in the dark, damp tunnels behind them. As the first Italian shadows appeared over the lip of the trenches, the last men standing took a final, ragged breath and opened fire. The final assault didn't feel like a movie. It felt like a slow, drowning sensation in a sea of gray smoke. The ammunition crates were finally empty. The heavy machine guns were warped from the heat of constant fire, and the last of the water had evaporated into the humid, metallic air. When the Italian infantry finally breached the inner galleries of the shattered fort, they didn't find the invincible giants they had feared. Instead, they found 800 hollowed-out shells of men, their uniforms stiff with dried blood and white concrete dust, standing in a silence so heavy it felt like lead. There was no cheering, no triumphant roar from the victors. The Italian soldiers, who had spent 16 days pouring 100,000 shells into this ridge, stopped in their tracks. They looked into the eyes of the defenders and saw a reflection of their own exhaustion and shared trauma. They weren't looking at enemies anymore. They were looking at survivors of a man-made natural disaster. The air was still thick with the smell of high explosives and the bitter taste of defeat, but there was a strange, haunting dignity in the way the Greek soldiers stood their ground, even as they lowered their useless weapons. The commander of the fort, a man who had aged decades in just over 2 weeks, stepped forward through the rubble. His ears were still bleeding from the concussive force of the final bombardment, but his gaze remained steady. He didn't offer a plea for mercy. He offered the heavy, silent respect of a man who had done the impossible. The Italian officers, in a rare moment of military chivalry, stood at attention and saluted. They didn't treat the 800 as captives, but as fellow soldiers who had stared into the mouth of hell and refused to blink. The siege was over, but the psychological scars of those 16 days would never heal. They walked out of the ruins and into the blinding sunlight, leaving behind a mountain that had been ground into dust, but a lasting spirit that remained entirely unbroken until the very end. The dust eventually settled, and the screaming of the artillery faded into a permanent, ringing silence that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Siege of the Ridge was never just a battle over a line on a map. It was a devastating collision between industrialized destruction and the raw, unyielding human spirit. 100,000 shells had been fired to silence 800 men. Yet as the survivors finally walked out of the smoke-filled ruins, they didn't look like defeated captives. They carried the heavy, haunted weight of those 16 agonizing days in their eyes, a psychological burden that no military medal or political victory could ever hope to compensate for. The Italian officers who stood at attention and saluted their enemies understood something profound in that moment. You can pulverize reinforced concrete, you can shred steel into ribbons, and you can tear the very earth apart, but you cannot easily extinguish the primal will of someone defending their own home. This story isn't a celebration of conflict, but a chilling, humanized reminder of its absolute horrific cost. It is a psychological study of what happens when a human being is pushed past every conceivable limit and still stubbornly refuses to break. The ridge remains today, a scarred and silent monument to the ghosts of the 800. It stands as a testament to the terrifying intimacy of a siege, where the greatest victory isn't found in a grand conquest, but in the simple, defiant act of surviving one more day against impossible odds. Those men were the living embodiment of the last man standing, a shadow that still haunts history, reminding us that the human heart is often the only thing left when the world falls to dust.